I think we still have a lot more stuff.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. If you have not scanned in on one of the QR codes, please try to do that on your way out. I'm happy to be able to introduce Richard Mendel. We're very excited to be able to have him present. He wasn't able to be here in person, so he was able to accommodate and do this presentation virtually. Richard Mendel is a senior research fellow for Youth Justice, where he conducts research and writes reports to promote reform for our nation's youth justice systems. Prior to joining the Sentencing Project, Richard spent more than 20 years as an independent writer and researcher on youth justice and other social justice issues. During that time, he authored several highly cited publications on juvenile justice for the Annie Casey Foundation. As a journalist, Richard has published articles in the Atlantic, Washington Monthly, the Marshall Project, Legal Times, Baltimore Sun, News and Observer, the American Prospect, and other publications. He holds a bachelor's in public policy from Duke University and a master's in journalism from the University of Maryland. I'm going to sit down and let him get started.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for having me. It's great to be with you in Nebraska, even though I'm not in Nebraska, but close enough thanks to the miracles of technology. As Amy explained, I've been doing a lot of research and writing about youth justice for a long time, since the 1990s, in fact, and I've written a lot of reports over the years. It's only recently, though, that I've gotten really interested in diversion, which is the focus of my talk today. And rather, most of my research over time is focused on reducing confinement in youth justice. I've written about alternatives to detention. I did a lot of work for the Annie Casey Foundation's Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, and a lot about incarceration. In 2011, I did a comprehensive study called No Place for Kids that documented all the reasons why mass incarceration for youth is counterproductive. I did a follow-up report about how there's systemic abuses in youth correctional facilities all over the country. 43 states since 1970 and 29 states since 2000 have had systemic documented cases or patterns of systemic abuse. I wrote about the Missouri model of youth corrections, which is much more positive, a sense of, and it gets better results and has a much more positive and humane approach. Then about 8 years ago, the Casey Foundation asked me to begin looking at practices around juvenile probation, which is something I hadn't really thought about before, I hadn't looked at before. And it was then that the diversion issue jumped out at me it came to the forefront in my mind. The conventional model for probation, giving kids a long list of rules and conditions and then monitoring their compliance, punishing them when they don't follow all the rules, had no evidence of effectiveness. And it just didn't make sense in light of what we now know about adolescent behavior and adolescent brain development. Lots of research found that kids who were diverted out of court did better than the kids who went through the court process. And lots of the research found that the disparities in this stage of the process in diversion were huge and hugely important. So I got interested in this question: should most kids who engage in delinquent behaviors enter the justice system? Last year, I had the chance to delve more deeply than ever into this evidence and scan the diversion practices throughout the country, and it resulted in a new report, which maybe I'm going to be talking to you about, which I will be talking to you about. So I'm going to describe my findings, and I hope you'll find them as interesting as I have. I'm going to talk today about 5 key lessons. The first is that the justice system is toxic for youth. It sounds harsh, but the research shows that the justice system is really unhealthy for young people. Second, in light of how counterproductive it is to arrest youth and involve them in the justice system, diversion is vastly underutilized in the United States. Third, diversion is a point of deep, pervasive, and hugely consequential disparities. In other words, unequal treatment at the diversion stage plays a pivotal role in perpetuating the juvenile justice system's vast racial and ethnic disparities in confinement nationwide. Fourth, common practices, many of them around diversion, employed for diversion, unnecessarily exacerbate disparities and they limit diversion opportunities generally. And fifth, and finally, there are many constructive reforms available to address these problematic practices, to expand the use of diversion, and to reduce disparities. So I'm going to talk about each of these lessons in turn, but let's start first by defining our terms. What do we mean when we use what do I mean when I use the term diversion? As you'll see, diversion is as you might know, diversion is sort of a fuzzy term in juvenile justice. It's not quite as bad as accountability, which we all talk about, but don't really agree what it means. But it's still pretty loose. Diversion is. It's used to describe commonly used to describe any decision that allows a young person to avoid a deeper level of system penetration. Includes deferred prosecution or consent decree sometimes, probation instead of placement, specialized courts instead of standard probation or placement. It's also used to describe a set of programs or agreements that youth might be required to follow to avoid prosecution. But for the purposes today, for the purposes of the report that I've written, we'll be talking about diversion as a decision to address delinquent conduct without involving a young person formally in the court system. More specifically, diversion can be thought about as pre-arrest diversion, where the young person is not arrested at all for the misbehavior, or as pre-court diversion, where a young person is informally processed, they've been arrested or referred to court, but the court decides not to make a formal case of them, but to address them outside of the court. It's not post filing alternatives to adjudication or placement once a kid has been filed on. It's not any particular diversion program. It can be no program at all. It's only talking about diversion as a decision that ensures that the young person's alleged law breaking is addressed outside the formal court system. So that's what we're talking about today. But now we're going to do, we're going to stop me talking and start you providing your input. We're going to do a poll. We're going to do two polls today, but this is the first one. And if you either go to the website and plug in the code, or you use the QR code here, you'll get a series of questions. We're going to take a few minutes, give you a little bit of time to look at it and see, and let's provide, and the first set of questions is, how does your jurisdiction handle diversion? Here you can see some of the questions, and it should show some results on the screen. Amy, I'm not able to see how many people, I don't know how to gauge whether people are done or how long it will take them to do this.
Well, nothing's being shared currently. But I suppose they're probably done or almost done.
Like, I'll give it a few more seconds and then come back.
Anybody need more time? We're good.
Okay, so let me go back to sharing my screen. So we'll come in a few minutes. We'll review the results. So 1 second. So the first lesson is that the justice system is toxic for youth. And let's start with a little bit of exercise. It's not the ideal setting for audience participation since I'm so far away. But I thought I'd start with a thought experiment, and if you can indulge me. So the question is, what would you want if your child started to get into trouble? If they started smoking pot and got caught with it on school grounds? If they were experimenting with other drugs and selling some of it to support their habit and they got caught? They were hanging out with a crowd of kids who like to steal cards and go joyriding and they were caught, or they were just hot-tempered and lacked the ability to control anger and started getting into fights that led to arrests or arrests for assault and battery. Would your would you want your child to be arrested, handcuffed, and driven to the police precinct or detention center, detained to live and sleep next to other troubled teens rather than at home with your family, disconnected from school, given a long list of required behaviors and threatened with confinement if they didn't comply, made to pee in a bottle and for a drug test with grave potential consequences for a dirty result when perhaps a third of his or her class is smoking pot and perhaps doing other drugs as well without the same consequences, enrolled in a court-ordered treatment program where failure can result in prosecution, or sent involuntarily to a residential treatment facility, a group home, or even a youth prison, rather than remaining home with your family and having opportunities to remain in school, participate in the normal rites of passage for adolescence. Would you rather those things, or would you rather they be enrolled in a counseling or substance abuse treatment program, assigned a mentor or a tutor, receive job training or a job opportunity, a community positive youth development program focused on your child's interest, a Boys and Girls Club or YMCA membership, assigned a credible messenger or youth advocate or wraparound care if they had really significant issues, or involved in a restorative justice process where they can acknowledge and take steps to repair the harm they've caused and to maybe learn some more empathy. So I think you get the idea. When we reflect on what young people need, and particularly young people with behavioral challenges, when we think about what the justice system offers, what its strategic advantages are, the two just don't connect. The justice system is not well positioned and it's ill-equipped to address youth behavior issues effectively. And there's no strategic advantage to deliver interventions that we all know are most helpful. Community organizations and public agencies unconnected with the court are far more likely to understand and relate to young people in a meaningful and constructive way, and to provide troubled young people with what they need to reverse delinquent behavior patterns and get back on track. The court system, not so much. So at a gut level, that exercise, it illustrates the spirit of why I've gotten so interested in diversion. But we know better than to set policy or make decisions from the gut level. We need to look at the data and the research, and that's what I've been doing. So now I'm going to tell you what those data and what that research says. Let's start with that first question. Number one, how do we know that the justice system is toxic for youth and that diversion is a superior option for most youth accused of law breaking? The question has been studied exhaustively over several decades, but the single most ambitious, detailed, and carefully controlled study ever done was completed just in the last couple of years. It was called the Crossroads Study, and if you haven't seen it, you really should. Here's a summary of the results. You can see, well, let me tell you about the study first. It involved more than 1,000 young people in Orange County, California, Jefferson Parish, around New Orleans, Louisiana, and in Philadelphia. And all of them were arrested for the first time for moderately serious offenses, such as drug possession, theft, assault, that were on the edge of what their local judges tended to divert or not divert. It was sort of a coin flip for those. And then the scholars tracked these 1,000 young people over several years and measured their progress on 19 different outcomes. And here you can see the results. The score, if you like sports and statistics, the score for formal processing was 0 for 19. Or to be fair, the court process was 0 wins, 9 losses, and 10 ties. The better results for youth formally processed in court on none of the 19 outcomes did the young people formally processed do better. On about half of them, there was no difference. And on the other half, including many of the most serious, significant outcomes, the kids who were formally processed did much worse. They had a higher likelihood of rearrest. They had a higher likelihood of subsequent incarceration. They had more self-reported violent behavior. They had more association with delinquent peers. They had a lower perception of their own future opportunities. They had lower graduation rates. So much worse outcomes on some of the most important outcomes for the kids who were formally processed versus the kids who were diverted. Or in Ohio, you can take a look at this slide. It compares results for youth who were diverted versus comparable youth who were placed on probation and given other responses. And at every risk level, the kids who were diverted from court had less subsequent court and justice system involvement. If you look particularly at the bars at the right, that's for kids who were deemed high risk. The results showed that an enormous gap, a huge benefit, where higher risk youth have much higher recidivism when they're higher risk youth have lower recidivism when they're diverted than when they're sent to court. We'll come back to this idea later when we're talking about reform steps, because I think in many jurisdictions, maybe many in Nebraska, diversion is limited to a very narrow set of kids who have committed just the least serious offenses. Here we're looking at kids who committed the most serious offenses, and still diversion is working much, much better. So this study and these two studies were not outliers. The two recent meta-analyses, you can see the results here. That were you can see the names of them here. They both found that diversion had much lower future delinquent adjudications, much less involvement in the system. And you can see a quote from one of the two here. Juvenile system processing does not appear to have a crime control effect. In fact, almost all of the results are negative in direction as measured by prevalence, incidence, severity, and self-report outcomes. Kids who are diverted do less crime. Kids who are processed in court do more. We also have research showing that pre-arrest diversion delivers even better results. Lots of research finds that being arrested in adolescence has damaging effects on kids' future. They're more likely to drop out. They're less likely to attend and succeed in college. There's substantially lower incomes at age 30. There's also strong evidence that diverting kids before arrest, and that's pre-arrest diversion, yields even better outcomes than informal processing after an arrest. So a young person commits an offense, there's two choices. Should they be arrested or not? And if they are arrested, should they be prosecuted formally or not? What the results show is that the evidence shows that not arresting them yields the best results. Arresting them and then diverting them yields somewhere in between, and then arresting and formally prosecuting them yields the worst results. In the Crossroads study that I just mentioned, in one of the sites in California, the researchers identified an additional comparison group of young people who had engaged in similar levels of delinquency, but were never arrested. And they found that these young people were less likely to be arrested in subsequent months than the kids who were arrested, who had been arrested the first time. And the difference was larger. In terms of future outcomes, as I was saying, the kids who were never arrested had the lowest arrest rates. The kids who were arrested but not formally processed had the second, and then the kids who were formally processed did the worst. Likewise, studies in Florida show that youth who are offered a civil citation instead of arrest are less likely to be arrested and referred to court in subsequent charges. So there's growing excitement around the country in the idea of pre-arrest diversion, and not just diverting kids after their arrests. So that's all of the evidence that I have for you today about why I say that the justice system is toxic for youth. Arresting kids, formally processing them in court leads to worse outcomes. So now let's go to lesson number 2. Diversion is vastly underutilized. Here you can see a chart. A colleague of mine calls this the most boring chart in the world. Nothing changes. I mean, during this period since 1996, think of all the changes that have happened in our society in terms of crime, in terms of what we learned about adolescent development, in terms of what we learned about what works in juvenile justice, in terms of all the evidence I've just told you about the toxic effects of formally processing kids in courts. Our justice system has done nothing to change. And this use of diversion in our country is vastly lower. Here you can see comparison to other countries. As you saw, 46% of the cases are diverted. In many other countries, 75, 80, 83% of the kids are diverted from court. In these countries, the leaders of the justice system have looked at the evidence, and they said that they can see that the justice system is not constructive, that is toxic for young people. So we're going to steer our justice system away from these kids, and we're going to steer the kids away from the justice system, and we're going to address their misbehaviors in other ways. Now let's, I wasn't able to come back to the results of the, I don't know where to find the results of your poll. It's not coming up for me. So I don't know what to do now. Amy, do you have any, are you able to get to the page where their results?
I would have to go into my email and click on that link. Can we just take like a timeout real quick?
Sure.
How about let's see if any audience members want to just share while Amy's looking at that. Does anybody want to share a little bit about diversion works in your community? I will bring you a mic so that he can hear you. Don't be shy.
I will. I will, and I can yell that I know. So I think you're.
It was working quite well yesterday, but somehow it's disappeared, my ability to reach that.
So I'm a community provider. So my take on it, I know how the referral process.
Should I stop sharing, or you can put up?
Can you hear me? Can you-
If you can get the results, then we can look.
All right. So Richard, I've got Shannon here. She's gonna share with the room and with you if you can hear her
Sure.
about some of the things that she's seen.
So I'm a
Great.
community provider, and we get some referrals for programming from Diversion. And I've also sat through some of the trainings that have kind of talked about the diversion process. So I'm just saying what I feel about it, and other people can share their input. But I kind of wish that there was a button to click between, yes, I like it, it's working great, and meh. I feel like we're kind of in between those two, where I feel like we have a pretty good referral process. Obviously, you know, we could be doing more in getting those referred, but it kind of is limited by our community and the amount of resources available, as well as I think sometimes, you know, just the willingness of the youth to participate in things like that limits some engagement in that. But as far as the referral process goes, I feel like between the county attorney who gets the law enforcement and sends it to Diversion, and how Diversion refers out to the community, they've got a number of different programs here for diversion. They've got a mental health diversion, they've got truancy diversion, they've got traditional standard diversion, a more intensive diversion. I think I think maybe there's one more type of diversion. So while we might not be diverting enough, and things are changing so that more people are ending up in the getting court filings, I still think that we're headed in the right direction, I'll say.
And I know too, like, at least for Lancaster County, we really work closely with the county attorney's office to not overserve youth. And so if they are really initial entry, low level, low risk, you know, we try to no charge as many kids as we can, give them a warning letter, that sort of thing. And we tailor our diversion plans according to their risk, right? And so like, if they are very low risk, they already have a lot of supports in their life, we're not going to give them a million requirements, you know, and we're going to spend our time, you know, really addressing individualized needs, and things like that. I don't know if there's anyone from other counties in here that want to share how diversion works in their county. We'd love to hear from you.
It's not showing the answers. I wonder if we have to present it and do it live.
Yeah, I don't know.
Do you want to try to do the poll again or just skip it?
We can.
Okay, let me share. Okay, so if
You're
you,
not- Did you?
oh, I got it. Yeah, I did. Okay, we're gonna try this again.
Okay, so if you all want to do this poll again, we'll see if it gives us the answers live. Is that
Yeah,
what we're doing?
yeah, we're gonna try it.
Okay.
I didn't test this though. I know how to use this. Is it working? Okay, all right, we're answering.
Are we getting answers?
Yeah, we got
Oh.
some unsures.
Here we go. So you kind of see how, are you able to see this too? Oh yeah, you're showing screen.
Yeah.
I think it depends on.
This is great.
Because I think truancy gets filed before, they get filed before they do the program, but.
Yeah,
Right?
I think so. It depends probably by county, but.
Okay, well, we got a lot of sometimes and one yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna go to the next question.
What is it? What was the answer?
I mean, even though you referred, there was this hybrid.
The word, we're not. Everyone else.
Yes.
We should have put some other options, like.
Hybrid.
Government.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the next question. Oh, getting a couple more. So mostly county attorney's office.
So this is a pretty big gap that we're noticing on this one between what is and what people think should be. A very big gap.
Okay. Next question. Consistency statewide, so people don't have to do it all, so people can over 100.
Well, depends on the charge rate. Unless it comes to on the office rate adjustment. So the currency.
You wanna go to the next one? Okay. Should be an NA, we don't charge a fee, but.
I guess we don't charge a fee. Nat, the M&M smell. The M&M smell.
Okay.
Like out of court? Yeah.
Nobody knows. He's not here.
County attorneys. Sessions.
They even- Yeah, we should- we should- It's in here.
Good job, Bob.
Okay. Last one. Okay. I'm gonna stop sharing and you can go do your PowerPoint.
Sure.
Let's see, how do I do that? Stop. There we go.
Okay, come back to it. So that took enough time that we probably should skip the second set of polling. So the third of my lessons is that there's a diversion is a point of deep and pervasive disparities, and these disparities are very consequential for young people's futures. It seems like to the extent that people in Nebraska know how this is working by race and ethnicity, that you also are suffering with pretty big disparities in diversion. It's really one of the most consistent findings of the research and the data. Here you can see, starting with this slide, just the overall share of young people diverted from formal processing in 2019 by race and ethnicity. And it's a big gap, 52% of the white kids and 40% of the black kids, and somewhere in between for Hispanic, American Indian, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander kids. The disparities have been getting worse and not better. This chart is just looking at black versus white. It was a 20% gap in 2006. It's a 29% gap in 2020, the most recent year for which there's data. And so it's getting worse instead of better. And you can see that it's not just a matter of which crimes young people are committing by race and ethnicity. There's a gap in every single category. The back on the left there is the original when I showed you that there was 52% versus 40, but on violent index crimes, white kids are more likely to be diverted than black kids. On property index crimes, black kids are less, white kids are more likely to be diverted than on public order offenses, on drug offenses, on every offense category. If you're a white kid, you're much more likely to be diverted. If you're a black kid, much less likely to be diverted. Now, the research confirms this, that when they control for all the background factor, the prior history and any other kind of relevant variables, at least 20 academic studies have found documented statistically significant disparities in diversion decisions. And the research also shows that these disparities have huge consequences, that early involvement in the court system leads to more future arrests and other bad outcomes, poor school attendance, higher dropout rates, all the things that we were talking about. And greater likelihood of formal processing also means that youth of color accumulate longer court histories, which means harsher consequences for any subsequent misconduct. So it's a bad cycle that continues. There was a probation chief in New Mexico that once talked to you about the justice system as a juvenile justice system as a lobster trap. Once you get in, it's really hard to get out. So it's really important to keep kids out as much as you can, and that opportunity has been being afforded to white children much more than kids of color, especially black youth. the research, I've been doing a lot of research over time about disparities in youth justice, and there's 4 points in the continuum where disparities are most pervasive. One of them is who gets arrested. Another is who gets referred to court from school, so the school to prison pipeline. Another is who gets diversion and who doesn't. And the fourth one is detention. And detention has been the focus of the biggest national juvenile justice reform initiative in the country, JDAI, and the other three all relate to diversion, which has gotten so much less attention. Now let's go to lesson number 4, which is that many common policies and practices employed in diversion unnecessarily exacerbate disparities and limit diversion opportunities. I'll come to that slide in a second. So what's causing all the crippling disparities at diversion? And I found 2 main factors. And the first one is subjectivity. Currently, decisions about diversion in most places are made sort of on the fly. The process is idiosyncratic. There's no sort of real rules and a process or uniform process to decide. And we know that in general, whenever subjectivity is allowed to reign in injustice, disparities and bias are soon to follow. Implicit bias plays a huge role in perpetuating disparities in many sectors of American life, in employment, housing, lending, healthcare, but it plays an especially big role in the justice system. The Philip Goff found that police officers and lay people to overestimate the ages of Black children accused of felonies by 5 years, and they view them as willfully delinquent, tend to view them as, for white children, they underestimate the ages of the white young people and see them as much more often as victims of circumstance. That's the context that causes the misbehavior, not the young people themselves. Recently, there was a study done in Arizona that looked at these questions. It was really interesting. The left graph shows just in general what's the share of kids diverted by race, and it looks very much like the national chart. 53% of the white kids are diverted, 38% of the Black kids, and somewhere in between for Hispanic and Native American kids. But for this study, the researchers went a lot deeper. They delved into the files of the young people's cases. And what they found was that there were glaring disparities in the written notes of the court officials. They included negative attributions about the young people's characters 6 times more often for the Black kids, 3 times more often than for the Hispanic kids, 4 times more often for Native American kids than the comparable white kids. So it's just the way that they're being viewed, the implicit bias just jumped out of those case files, and they very much were tied to very correlated with whether the kids were offered diversion or not. The lesson's clear that as long as clear rules and guidelines for diversion don't exist and diversion is allowed, implicit bias to sway the diversion decisions, the disparities will remain inevitable. There's also tons of evidence that the negative assessments of young people's families play a big factor in diversion decisions and whether they're offered opportunities. Studies consistently find that court officials find families of color more troubled or dysfunctional, describe them that way, or less able to support their kids' success, or less interested or willing to work with the court, and that these family assessments are also tightly correlated with diversion decisions. There's also a lot of justice by geography, that there's the lack of clear guidelines and policies for diversion that allows free reign to subjectivity, and that allows for vast differences in diversion opportunities within states. Here's a set of charts. This is in Maryland, Baltimore City versus Baltimore County, the share of kids diverted. You can see in this middle one is in Iowa. The blue line, the darker blue at the bottom is the share of cases diverted. You can see it's wildly different from place to place. In Colorado, that's Denver versus Arapahoe County. It's not a justice system if there's can be that many differences or that large differences by geography. So subjectivity, all of these things are pointing to subjectivity in the decision-making process, and that's a crippling aspect of diversion and the crippling problem in how diversion is offered and delivered around the country. The other problem with diversion is a slew of widespread but misguided policies and practices that seem objective in theory or in the way they describe themselves, but harm youth of color disproportionately in practice. What am I talking about? In most states, there continues to be no clear rules or policy guidance for the use of diversion, no detailed data collected on diversion. We saw here many of you don't have any, and none of you, it seemed like, knew what share of cases get diverted and what share are formally processed. It's a critical factor. If the diversion is so much better for kids, we ought to know who's being diverted and who's not. There's little or no effort to analyze diversion data by race and ethnicity. We saw that many or most of the jurisdictions don't collect that data, and there's no explicit goals, policy goals, to expand the use of diversion or to reduce disparities. In the resulting policy vacuum, many problematic practices remain commonplace. So let's start to look at what some of those are. Eligibility is often limited to first-time offenses or to low-level misdemeanors, or sometimes only status offenses. That there's the way that I'll go through the list quickly, and then we'll talk more in detail about them. Let me make sure that I'm not gonna. Okay. So in terms of eligibility for diversion to first-time offenses, it's a long-standing practice in much of the country, but it's not rooted in any kind of evidence. And it also has an enormous impact on racial equity because the arrest rates of Black kids and other kids of color are so much higher than white kids. If you limit it to first-time offenses, then you're excluding many opportunities for kids of color to benefit from diversion. They lose subsequent opportunities. Limiting diversion to misdemeanors or to status offenses especially has no basis in research. Remember that Ohio study, the kids who were highest risk, the kids who were involved in the most serious offending had the biggest benefit from diversion, but in many places, and many places, perhaps in Nebraska, diversion is limited to kids with much lower level offending. In terms of employing passive and ineffective methods to inform youth about their eligibility, in many jurisdictions, the kids who are deemed eligible for diversion, many of them don't ever participate because they don't enroll because nobody really goes out and reaches out to them. There's kids of color, and especially it affects racial bias because racial outcomes, because kids of color and families of color are much more likely to mistrust the justice system. They're more likely to have difficulties with phone service, with stable housing, with other things that makes it harder to reach them and harder for them to comply. So it requires more effort from the court to contact kids of color, and to enroll them in diversion. But yet it remains in many jurisdictions the common practice just to send a letter to families informing them of eligibility for diversion, and then also to dictate the time and the date and the location for the diversion intake meeting without any consultation. And often that can lead to many youth missing out on diversion opportunities, especially kids of color, and that it worsens disparities. And that's what they found in Kentucky. They passed a law in 2014 expanding diversion substantially, but they found that it was mostly at first benefiting white children and not the kids of color. And so they looked at their policies and practices, and they found that they did have that kind of a system where you got diversion, you were identified for diversion, but they'd send you a form letter. And the response rate from the kids of color was much lower, families of color much lower than for the white children. So they had a meeting, and they changed the policy in a day, and they started, we're not going to send these letters anymore. We're going to make phone calls. We're going to keep making phone calls till we reach someone. We're going to invite them to the process. We're going to explain the process to them and the benefits of it. And we're going to talk with them and collaborate and to figure out where's the time and place of the meeting rather than dictating it to them and counting them as non-compliant if they don't attend. And it really made a big difference in reducing disparities in diversion in that state. In terms of imposing, another problem is that many jurisdictions impose rules and requirements that make it difficult for parents and families to meet the requirements necessary to participate in diversion. There's rules that require that the parent or guardian be willing to and able to attend meetings at inconvenient times. Youth and families of color are more likely to face difficulties participating in diversion activities due to work and schedule conflicts, transportation challenges, and demands that meetings be held in locations that are difficult for them to reach and not in their own home neighborhoods. Also, sometimes the definition of family can be narrow. Families of color are much more likely to be multi-generational, to be blended families, and so that any kind of narrow definition that requires only a parent or guardian can unnecessarily limit the opportunities for kids of color to participate in diversion. There's rules that require young people to admit guilt as a condition for diversion. That's common in many places, but it's much less acceptable to many kids and families of color given their mistrust of police and the courts. and it's not necessary for the success of the program. There's charging fees. I see that a lot of your jurisdictions charge fees. Fortunately, a lot of them will waive those fees in cases where the families can't afford it, but whether or not the families know that, maybe their families can be afraid and not participate out of fear that there's costs. And so that even if you do waive the fees, there's a policy in place to waive the fees that if you don't make that completely clear to families with limited means, you can chase young people away from this opportunity, which means they're less successful, means more crime because they're more likely to commit more offenses if they aren't offered opportunities for diversion. Then there's the problem of structuring diversion like probation, or here it's operated by the county attorney, the prosecutor, rather than the court, as in many other places. But it looked like in most of the jurisdictions, this was one of the most interesting findings of this poll that we saw, is that most of the places the diversion is operated by the county attorney's office, but most of the people in your room right now think that it would be much better if community providers provide diversion. The opportunity diversion is an opportunity to connect young people to community organizations who can better address their needs and inspire their growth, or I would argue that. They're much more likely to offer connection to people who look like the young people, who relate to them better. They don't have the role conflict that they're enforcing an agreement at the same time as trying to support and benefit, help the young person grow and mature. It makes much more sense to me to offer a light touch diversion for many youth, rather than a probation-like opportunity, to offer positive youth development opportunities, to offer restorative justice interventions to help youth understand and repair the harm they've caused, or referral to social services and for youth with more complex needs. All of these things can be operated, should be operated, to me, logically. The only advantage of the court system or the county attorney is that they have the benefit that they can apply punishment. And if we're trying to divert kids away from the punishment system, this really, to me, makes much more sense to allow the community, for the kids whose behavior doesn't really threaten public safety, that they've been diverted. It makes much more sense to me to allow the community to do it. The last is sending young people back to court for failing to comply with their diversion rules and requirements. It sounds like most of the jurisdictions that you work with do this. And it doesn't make sense to me, given the research showing that the justice system is toxic for youth, and that most kids, there's clear research that most young people who enter the justice system will never return. So why isn't it not better just to document the case as unsuccessful in diversion, without returning the young person to court to face the consequences that we know are bad for them and bad for public safety? This is another factor that exacerbates disparities, because the research shows that youth of color are more likely than white youth to fail diversion and have their cases returned to court. So now we're going to go to part number 5 of my presentation, which is that there are many constructive opportunities, many steps that you can take to expand diversion and reduce inequities at this critical decision point, the diversion decision. These opportunities are available at the state level, and they're available at the local level. It sounds like maybe I'll talk about the state first, even though you guys are not state policymakers. So several states in recent years have taken steps to expand diversion as part of larger juvenile justice reform laws. Here's a list of Utah, South Dakota, Kentucky, Kansas, Hawaii, West Virginia, Indiana, Maryland have all taken steps to expand. Many in these states, they've mandated diversion or made it the default option in many cases. They've expanded eligibility for diversion to kids with more serious offenses, or second or third or fourth opportunities, rather than limiting it to just one. They've reduced imbalances in diversion opportunities within states. They provided funding support for diversion programming. They've limited periods, the length of time of diversion oversight. They provided counseling and case management interventions in some states for youth who might otherwise fail diversion or return to court. So when a young person is not complying, rather than send them back to court, they convene a meeting, a team, to say, hey, what's going on with the young person? What can we do? And to help them succeed, rather than throwing them into the punishment process. And they've improved data collection in order to track progress and analyze disparities. Other states have taken important strides to expand diversion through other means. To promote, in Florida, for instance, they promoted the widespread use of civil citations instead of arrests, more than 10,000 young people every year. They've allocated state funds to support diversion programming. Colorado's an example. They've raised the minimum age for juvenile court, making diversion the automatic for all youth below the new age threshold. Several states. They've eliminated or reduced fines and fees for diversion. 2 states have taken direct action to reduce disparities in diversion. I was talking a little bit about Kentucky before, and that they've changed their process for signing young people up into diversion. They've also taken the step of, they've gone and analyzed which they have now a presumption that kids will be diverted for all misdemeanors. And so they looked at, okay, where are prosecutors overriding these presumptions and not diverting kids who are eligible for, where are judges doing that? And they've gone out and talked to the state administrative office of the courts, has gone out and talked to those prosecutors and those judges and say, hey, what's going on here? What are you doing? And what can we do to change it? And it's really led to big changes. In New York State, they have a new racial equity policy academy for county teams to address disparities in diversion. They've had teams convene and they look at their data, they strategize, and they're working on, and they've made it their statewide goal to reduce disparities in diversion. That's the most of their work now in disproportionate minority contact and racial and ethnic disparities in juvenile justice is focused on this diversion decision point. And you can see here with this chart that these reforms can have a huge impact. This is the share of referrals to juvenile court that are diverted in just since 2015. We've gone from 31% to 60% in Utah. Of cases that are being diverted. It's a huge difference. They've just decided, they've looked at the evidence and say the diversion is more positive, better outcomes for the state, better outcomes for public safety, better outcomes for young people than formal processing, and said, look how big a jump that they've taken. Let's jump to see abundant opportunities for reform also at the local level. What can local courts do? First, they can change their eligibility rules. They can eliminate rules prohibiting diversion after the first offense. They can allow diversion for all misdemeanors and many felony offenses. They can require diversion for low-level misbehavior at school and in the community. They can eliminate admission of guilt as a criteria. They can stop using subjective assessments of families to determine eligibility for diversion. They can also intensify efforts to contact engaged parents and guardians and other family members, as we've been talking. No more contact by mail only, and also to schedule meetings cooperatively rather than dictating. You can create new diversion pathways. You can create alternatives for police to employ in lieu of arrests in the community, the civil citations. You can have other pre-arrest diversion partnerships, the list of things you can see here. And you can create restorative justice alternatives to court processing, including programming targeted to youth accused of serious felonies or with other extended arrest histories. Several jurisdictions have done. There's an organization called Impact Justice that's creating a network of these diversionary restorative justice programs for kids with serious offenses. They're looking, and they've done this in many communities that are concentrated communities of color, and they're having some positive results. And you can give, as we were talking about before, give responsibility for overseeing diverted young people to community partners and allocate diversion programming funds to community-based organizations. And a lot of positive results with these. Another thing you can do, which is important to do, is to close the school to prison pipeline. You can remove SROs from the schools, prohibit arrests at schools for less serious offenses. You can create alternatives to arrests such as restorative justice or emergency mental health responses to address behavioral incidents at school rather than involving young people in the justice system, given all we know about the toxic effects of involving kids in the justice system. We can increase success rates in diversion and minimize consequences for noncompliance by ending the use of informal probation for diverted youth, by empowering community organizations that we've been talking about, by minimizing out-of-pocket costs, and we can not return young people to court for noncompliance absent a new offense. If the offense they've committed at the outset did not require a court involvement, then seems to me the evidence is clear that it's counterproductive to bring them back to court if their noncompliance does not involve a harm to the community. Finally, we can improve data tracking and analysis on diversion, and we can require every jurisdiction to track the share of eligible youth, the share of youth who are eligible for diversion, the share of youth who are actually diverted, the success and failure rates of the young people who are diverted, and to disaggregate all this data by race, ethnicity, and gender to see how fair it is and how it's affecting different populations differently. And then finally, we can set clear and ambitious goals for expanding the use of diversion and reducing disparities. We can set goals for pre-arrest diversion and pre-court diversion and informal processing. We can set goals for the share of youth diverted and share who complete successfully, then not just to offer diversion, but to make sure that the kids benefit from it. And we can, again, track the success rates of kids of diverted versus formally processed youth to really document and make clear if we're going to convince the political leaders that we're going to sustain support for diversion, we have to show that it works better. All the research evidence shows it, but I think that you need to show it in your jurisdiction with your young people and your families and your communities. The bottom line, and this is the end of my presentation, is that if you want to reduce system disparities in juvenile justice and you want to improve system outcomes, you need to expand and improve diversion. So thank you so much for having me. I think we're going to have a question period. I really appreciate you having me here.
Anybody have any questions for Nick? Yeah. You might have to come closer to so he can hear you.
It's for a presenter as well as the room, because I was wondering, so I'm 38. When I was 15, I did diversion. And I did a thing called youth court. Anybody remember that?
Yeah, like teen court.
Teen court. And I don't know if there's any research into the efficacy of that model, or if it just kind of fell out of fashion, or just didn't happen here anymore, or what happened with that. But it was kind of, yeah, it was kind of interesting. I had a pretty positive experience, I think, with the teen court. Obviously, like, that may not be representative of everybody's experience with it, but it was sort of, yeah, like, you participated in this thing where you were kind of, your terms of your diversion basically were set by a jury of your peers, other folks on diversion. And then you participated later in that same teen court where you would, yeah, like, kind of get some context of what had happened. And then as a team, you know, you would make decisions about, you kind of had like a menu of different, you know, things that you could require or ask of this young person. So, like, apology, I think either written or public, there was, you know, maybe community service, restitution. These things were all sort of, yeah, again, like a menu, a list that you checked off what you thought. And then there was some consensus built with the group. And this was overseen by like an attorney who I think was just a volunteer. And I don't know. Yeah, I was curious if anybody remembers that, why it went away, if it was a good model. Anybody remember that?
So my understanding, Sarpy County still runs a teen court program. There was one in Lancaster County that does not function anymore. I think Sarpy County is the only one that has it. I don't know specifically if the research shows that teen court models over traditional diversion models are better or worse. I thought they were pretty comparable. I think the idea is you get positive peer pressure by having kids as jurors. The flip side of that is there's no confidentiality of your participation in diversion then. And kids are supposed to sign a waiver. They're not going to talk about it at school, but it's not confidential at that point. Yeah. I don't know if Dick has any teen courts.
I'm a little bit embarrassed that I have not, I've had this question come up a couple times recently and I haven't had time to go and dig into the research, so I don't know. I'm a little bit sort of just, as a matter of principle, there's the confidentiality is one issue, and another is sort of stepping back and sort of what do young people need? And I think that what young people need is different from kid to kid, and some kids come in with real underlying needs that are driving behavior, and the teen court is probably not the place to identify and address that. Some kids have caused harm, and addressing the harm through a restorative process seems like a very positive element any kind of intervention, and this is different. It's sort of, it's still a punishment. What's the bad behavior? What's the punishment for it? Model. So, but on the other hand, I think that young people, I mean, many people report positive experiences, and I don't want to trash it. It just, it doesn't seem, it wouldn't be the first thing that I would think of as the best approach, but I don't have any evidence that it works better or worse than anything else.
Anybody else have any other questions? We have 1 more minute. Okay, I don't see any. Thank you so much for this presentation, Dick. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.